Good day, students. Today we'll be looking at the Haitian Revolution, and specifically we'll be looking at the effects of the Haitian Revolution, and we'll be focusing today on the social effects, economic effects, the effects the revolution had on the abolition movement, and the effects on the wider Caribbean. Now, socio-political effects. First is that Dessalines declared Haiti independent of France on January 1st, 1804. As you would have known, Haiti was once a colony of France, and when the Haitian Revolution started, they were fighting to gain freedom and independence from their colonial masters. And by the end of the Haitian Revolution, one of the effects or the result is that Haiti became one of the first independent colony in the Western Hemisphere and the first black-run islands and the first island to have gained their independence through resistance and revolt. Secondly, during the Haitian Revolution, more than 100,000 residents of the island died. This is a socio issue because this meant that the population declined, which will lead to other effects that we'll look at. Secondly, the whites of the society were no longer in control. This is a political effect because the society, like most other society of the time, was controlled and run by prominent white population. There were governors, there were leaders, they had the wealth, they had the influence. Now, with the Haitian Revolution, the whites were expelled from Haiti and it was now a black-run state. Next, we have all citizens, regardless of race, were considered free. This is both political and social, because before Haiti was a society based on a slave and slavery, and it was stratified by those who were freed and those who were enslaved, and the social standing was based on your status and your race. And now all persons were freed regardless of your race, and no more opportunities were presented to the persons within Haiti. As we continue the socio-political effects, we look at the fact that slaves were now freed and were declared independent, as was explained before. The traditional social hierarchy structure based on color was totally and permanently dismantled, as I explained before. Prior to, you had the whites at the top, and then you had the rich whites at the top, followed by the poor whites, followed by the mulattoes, followed by the free blacks, followed by the slaves, and that was the socio-economic structure. With the whites dispelled from Haiti, with slavery ended, and with Haiti's independence, this structure no longer exists. Next, we have Haitian Constitution allow African Indians and their descendants to settle in Haiti. So Haiti now became a place of refuge for a lot of people, a minority people, to come and to settle and to have a newfound opportunity and independence that they would have had in other islands. Next, we have Haiti soon become a place of refuge, as I just said before, for enslaved. So a lot of enslaved people would try to run away to Haiti, and it became a place of refuge. As we continue our socio-political effects, the Saint Dominic was renamed the island Haiti after the name used by the island's original indigenous inhabitants. So the name was changed. So prior to the Haitian Revolution, the island wasn't named Haiti, but was named Saint Dominic. As a result of the Haitian Revolution, the official name of the island was changed. Next, slaves in the Caribbean and the US were inspired by the success of the Haitian Revolution. So slaves all over heard of this, knew that blacks, enslaved African people fight for their freedom and won. This will spark ideas in the mind of those slaves, which we will look into as we continue. Now, it says that in 1811, 8 years after the after Haiti gained its independence, German coast uprising in Louisiana became the most serious slave revolt in the United States. And it is believed that this revolt in Louisiana was directly impacted or influenced by the success of the Haitian Revolution. Now let us look at economic effects. Other islands gained more opportunities of importing slaves and exporting sugar and coffee. For example, coffee production increased in Jamaica after the Haitian Revolution because of the loss of the former competitor of St. Dominic. And this is because the once blooming sugar economy of Haiti was now seriously crippled. Now, before the Haitian Revolution, Haiti was thriving, they were booming, they were the island that was competing and winning, and other islands couldn't keep up with them. With the Haitian Revolution, Haiti suffered a dramatic loss, and so they lost their marketplace, and other islands gained that marketplace, and other islands were thriving. So this is not just an economic effect on Haiti, but this is also an effect of the Haitian Revolution and the wider population. While Haiti was population was crumbling, and the population economy was crumbling, and they were losing their stands as a viable competitor, other islands like Jamaica was booming as a result of that loss. Next, we have the young United States imposed an embargo on Haiti, causing further financial chaos in post-revolutionary Haiti. Now, an embargo is a bond that was placed on Haiti by the United States that they couldn't trade with them. They weren't allowed to have exchange and trade, and this crippled their economy even more than it was crippled before. Haiti was forced to pay an exorbitant amount of fee of $1 million as repatriation to France for the revolution and all that happened as a result of the revolution. Now, why was Haiti going to pay it? We know that France needed the money, and they thought they were robbed their investments, and the planters were robbed their investments, and the colony has now lost. But why would France, Haiti, pay it? The reason why the huge sum of money was paid was to end the country's economic isolation and to re-establish trade with neighbors. But the debt crippled Haiti's economy so severely that it never recovered. Now, they paid it under the pretense that, okay, if we pay this money back to France, they will open up, because they had also closed trading with other French territories. They would open up the marketplace, and they were going to be able to start trading and to reestablish themselves as a marketplace and build their economy. But all it took, the investment and the money and the effort that they had to put into paying this debt, only put them in further debt and made it even impossible for them to recover. To today, they are still struggling to recover. Now, how did this affect the abolition movement? Because the revolution occurred at the time when the abolition movement was just about to begin in the Caribbean, the revolution may have helped to slow down the abolition process. It was an 11-year war. It was long, it was brutal, it was violent, as described by many historians, and this slowed down the process. Why and how? First and foremost, humanitarians who supported abolition became fearful. They became fearful that more blacks are going to start rebel. They became fearful that that the blacks were going to become barbaric. They became fearful of the loss of life, and they became fearful of the fact that just as though Haiti collapsed, other colonies might collapse. Independent Haiti was used by advocates of slave labor in the Caribbean to prove that the Caribbean plantation need to continue to use slave labor as the best source, because when Haiti no longer had slaves, their economy collapsed and the plantation society in Haiti died. And so when they were arguing as to why they should keep slavery, they used Haiti as an example to say without slaves, the plantation society will die. And without the plantation society, the colony will not be profitable to the mother countries. Next, the Haitian Revolution also motivated other revolutionary wars in other islands. And we know that the revolutionary wars also impacted the emancipation movement, both positively and negatively. And one thing that influenced and motivated other revolutionary war was the Haitian Revolution. What were the effects on the wider the Caribbean? Now, these effects somewhat have already been discussed and they will be overlapped here, but I wanted to specify them. The effects on the wider Caribbean is that in both Martinique and Guadeloupe, there was a rapid expanding group of free colors who were not only prosperous but did not experience as much legal discrimination enforced against them against the counterparts in Saint Dominic. Now, a lot of free colored move to Martinique and Guadeloupe. They were trying to escape Haiti and the revolution and the aftermath of Haiti. And when they went to these countries, they found that they were not discriminated and they prospered. And so not only did the free color found somewhere else to go and prosper, they would have helped to build the economy and the society in these two countries and other countries that they would have run to. Next, we have to look at, because of the revolution occurred when it did, which was at a time when abolition was in the year, the revolution may have helped to slow down the abolition process as members of humanitarian groups who supported abolition became fearful, as we just discussed. So other Caribbean countries who might have gotten their emancipation earlier, except because of fear, the abolition movement was slowed down and delayed as a result of the Haitian Revolution. Our third point is that planters were fearful that slaves would be influenced. They increased security in the plantation. Planters were worried. They were worried that their slaves are going to hear of the fact that slaves fight against the masters in Haiti and they won, and Haiti is now free, independent, and emancipation has come, and those slaves were living freely, and they're going to be inspired that if Haiti could do it, we can do it too. And as a result, they asked for more troops to come and to fortify, to quench any revolt that would come up. In 1794, there was an outbreak among the Maroons in Trelawney town of Jamaica, and the governor was quite sure that the Saint Dominic had influenced them. By this, it means that the governor in Jamaica at this time was convinced that the reason why the Maroons in Trelawney was rebelling was because they were influenced by the Haitian Revolution. They were inspired and they were motivated and they were riled up because of the Haitian Revolution, and so they themselves had an outbreak of some sort. It was felt that the Haitian Revolution was giving Jamaican blacks and mulattoes confidence to oppose the planters. They therefore plead to Britain to send more troops to defend themselves. Once again, the owners in Jamaica believed that this revolution in Haiti, the news was spread, and so the blacks and the mix in Jamaica were motivated and they now had more confidence and they were boosted up and they were going to oppose their masters. And once again, as a result, They got more soldiers, more troops, so that if this happened, they would be prepared for an attack. Our fifth reason, our fifth effect, I must say, on the wider Caribbean is that slaves from neighboring colonies were escaping in canoes to Haiti where they would be free. Enslaved were trying to escape. Enslaved people were found Haiti as a place of refuge and they were running there to gain their freedom. Another effect which we actually explored already is that other islands such as Jamaica were able to produce more because they were now gaining the market that Haiti lost. And Haiti was no longer a competitor. And so they were able to increase in export of goods, such as sugar and coffee, and increase in the import of slaves. And these are some of the effects of the Haitian Revolution. I want us to remember that the effects can be social, political, economic. The effects are not just on Haiti but on the wider Caribbean, and also that the Haitian Revolution also impacted the abolition movement overall. I hope you learned much, and please ask me a question below. Thank you.